Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we're going to be taking a look at some new and really interesting data out of China. We've also got an update on FSD Beta version 11, Gigafactory news, and more. Looking at the stock, unfortunately, what we've got on screen here does match the performance. I know we had an error on that yesterday, apologies for that, but Tesla down 3.1% today, closing at $187.71, while the Nasdaq was down 1.25%. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell did speak to the Senate today. I think that's a big part of the macro movement. As part of his opening statement or prepared remarks, he said that, quote, "The latest economic data have come in stronger than expected, which suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously anticipated. If the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we would be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes," end quote. So kind of a double whammy there. He talks about increasing the pace of rate hikes. Because rate hikes are expected at upcoming meetings, you kind of have to interpret that as increasing the amount of those rate hikes. So this is exactly what I said after we got the PCE report. 50 basis points definitely back on the table. If we look at the CME Group FedWatch tool today, they believe that expectations from a day ago have now flipped to a 50 basis point increase expectation for the March meeting, putting those expectations at about 71% versus just 31% a day ago. So we'll see. Obviously, things will depend a little bit on the CPI report, which we'll get a week from today, PPI the following day. Those will lead into the Fed meeting the following week. All right, let's get into the China numbers. We do have updated insured vehicle numbers for the prior week, so we'll take a look at those first, but we do actually have more interesting data now with January and February coming in. CPCA has released some cumulative data there, which is kind of our first real look at how the quarter is developing so far. There's a lot of year-over-year comparisons that are flawed in January because of Chinese New Year. That messes up month-over-month and quarter-over-quarter stuff too. So now that we've got January and February both in, we can look at those in aggregate, and that makes for a much better basis for comparison, but obviously Chinese New Year still a factor to consider. All right, first let's take a look at Tesla China insured vehicle numbers. We've got it for the week of February 27th to March 5th. Remember, this generally represents domestic or retail sales. So for Tesla, that's obviously heavily dependent on how they choose to allocate exports versus domestic. We've heard rumors over the last couple of weeks that Tesla has started to shift the allocation from exports now to focusing on domestic for the last part of the quarter. So far, these insured vehicle numbers have been off to a slower start, certainly than what we've seen in Q4, and that is despite the price cut. So definitely have been hoping to see these tick up. And that is what we continued to see this week with 13,266 vehicles insured, up from 10,705 the week prior. So for insured vehicle numbers, we've now got 9 weeks of data beginning on January 2nd. We can compare that to the first 9 weeks of Q4, that begins October 3rd. So it's not perfect quarter-over-quarter splits, but pretty close. And same number of days. We're now at about 71,000 so far in these 9 weeks versus about 85,000 in those first 9 weeks of Q4. Remember, Chinese New Year. Plus, more recently, we believe there's been Model 3 downtime at Shanghai. So these first 9 weeks are down about 16%, but that's not too dissimilar from the production downtime either. And remember, Q4 had production downtime in December rather than in the beginning of the quarter. So obviously these next few weeks are going to be very telling, but Tesla actually only needs to average about 12,500 over the next 4 weeks to roughly line up with Q4. Now with the price cuts, maybe you'd hope for a better quarter, and that's still definitely in the cards. But the point is that right now, even though it's been kind of a slow start to the quarter, they're still in pretty decent shape to potentially have a pretty strong quarter domestically in China. As usual, it's also important to consider context, so let's take a look at a couple things with BYD. Their insured vehicle count for the week did actually decline slightly week over week to just below 39,000. So same comparison to the first 9 weeks of Q4 like we did for Tesla, which was down 16% for Tesla. BYD actually down 21% on that basis. So a relative outperformance from Tesla there, and I would have to imagine that Tesla's number is more influenced by their export versus domestic allocation than BYD's. That's probably more reflective on sales, but could definitely be production too. I don't follow BYD close enough to know that for sure. Anyway, the comparison looks even more favorable for Tesla if we start to look more specifically at BYD models. Probably the Han and the Seal would be most comparable to what Tesla's offerings are. Thanks to Alex Potter's awesome chart here, we can see that the Model 3 and the BYD Han are relatively close in average selling price and volume. The Seal is newer, so that's why it's not showing up here, but it's pretty similar to the Han. So if we look at those two models, according to data from CN EV Post, the Han has sold about 25,000 in January and February. Those will be the bars in yellow here, and then the Seal has sold about 14,500. If we flip back to the Han and we look at the green bars for October and November, that's 2022. Sales for the Han were about 65,000 for those 2 months. So quarter to date, so far, first 2 months versus first 2 months, it's down 60% quarter over quarter. Even if you add in sales for the Seal and compare that against just the Han from last quarter, it's still down more than 50%, but the Seal itself actually did have sales in Q4, and despite basically just being introduced, the Seal sales alone are down about 40% quarter over quarter. So it's still early. Obviously, a lot of things could be contributing to numbers like this, and again, don't follow BYD closely enough to know for certain what all of those things may be, but you would have to think that Tesla's price cut probably having an impact here. If this continues, that could put BYD in a very challenging spot, and we're talking about BYD here, they're probably the closest follower to what Tesla is doing. So imagine the challenges for other automakers then. This is going to be a very, very interesting period of time for the auto industry. Last thing on China, and again, very important context to understand. So far we've been talking quarter over quarter numbers, but if we look year over year, which again at this point should account for Chinese New Year the same in both periods, the CPCA has reported that retail sales or domestic sales in China are down 21% for the first 2 months year over year. So that is a very challenging auto market in China right now. All right, moving on from China, we've got a possible update on FSD Beta version 11. Of course, 11.3 had gone to employees. We haven't heard a ton about it since then. Today, though, it looks like FSD Beta version 11.3.1 has started to roll out to employees. This was shared on a Facebook group. So if this is legitimate, which it looks to be, hopefully this is a sign that Tesla has made some updates, and maybe fingers crossed this can be the version to go out to customers. I think all of that has pretty much been on hold as Tesla works to address some of the issues from the recall that we have talked about. An interesting piece of what we're seeing here that may give us a little bit more hope of this rolling out more broadly is that there is a section in the release notes for over-the-air recall. We only see that as a category heading. Unfortunately, we don't have the description text included as well, but maybe that section talks about how those issues have been resolved. It's also possible that maybe that just includes information about the recall, like what we saw on Tesla's website. We'll keep an eye out for more information on that. Next, we've got a couple of new comments on Giga Mexico from the governor of Nuevo León. This relates to the timeline, saying, quote, "They are waiting for the final permits. Once that's done, they can start, hopefully this very month in March," end quote. What starting is exactly a little bit unclear. I think we had heard within the next 3 months for groundbreaking, but that there were already teams out there starting to begin the preparation process. But ultimately, what we don't want is permits to be holding anything back, so the sooner that those come, the better. So hopefully that's a good sign. And then he also added that, quote, "I think by next year, in 2024, there will be the first autos," end quote. So that kind of matches up with timelines that we have previously talked about, but pretty big difference between whether that's early 2024 or late 2024. We've also got a small update on Giga Berlin. Jörg Steinbach, not wanting to be outdone by all the fanfare around Giga Mexico, visiting Giga Texas, saying that it was important to give Tesla the reassurance of the ongoing support of the Brandenburg government for the potential extension of Giga 4 at Grünheide. Maybe announcements of factories elsewhere can help put a little bit of pressure on the current factory locations, realizing maybe that, hey, if we don't support this, that expansion, that's going to go somewhere else. All right, next, just a couple of quick takeaways from an appearance that Elon made today at an investor conference from Morgan Stanley. Most of the discussion focused on Twitter, but Elon did briefly talk about Tesla. It was sort of a question and answer format, so he was asked about the master plan and just gave a quick synopsis of that. Did mention cutting the next generation vehicles costs in half. He did say from a Model 3, thought that was kind of interesting. He did mention that it would be used almost entirely in autonomous mode, so basically the addressable market was all humanity. One thing though that I think they made pretty clear from Investor Day was that they're not solely committed to making this only a robotaxi, so this doesn't raise a new concern for me on that front. On Twitter, probably the most relevant thing to Tesla is that he did say that he thinks Twitter has a good shot at being cash flow positive in the second quarter. He also noted that he thinks there's an opportunity to grow Twitter into something quite spectacular. Talked a little bit about the vision for X. Said it's possible to create a very powerful financial experience, PayPal sort of halfway to that vision. He mentioned sending money easily from account to account, earning interest, having debt, and that it could be possible to become the biggest financial institution in the world, adding that you'll see on the vision for X. On SpaceX, he did say that Starship is getting ready for the first orbital launch. Of course, we know that. Said that they're getting close, hopefully in the next month or so, and thinks that they've got above a 50% chance of reaching orbit. So nothing too new if you've followed these companies closely, probably that cash flow comment on Twitter being the most notable. Lastly, then, we do have a quick update on Rivian. They announced yesterday that they intend to offer $1.3 billion of convertible senior notes due in 2029. So if that sale is successful, that'll add cash to the roughly $12 billion that they had in cash and cash equivalents to end the fourth quarter. It will, however, also add debt payments that Rivian needs to pay twice a year. So it's a little bit of a head scratcher given their cash position, but that's kind of what happens when you don't expect gross profitability until next year. Not talking net profitability there, just gross profit. So the cash burn will obviously be continuing. So I guess Rivian just trying to kind of build a bigger cushion. All right, that is where we'll leave it for today then. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you're subscribed and signed up for notifications. You can find me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast. And we'll see you tomorrow for the Wednesday, March 8th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.